Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Trump factor, assessing Quad solidarity in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Lisa Singh, and I'm the CEO of the Australia-India Institute. And I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar today. And in doing so, the Institute is building on a previous webinar that we held last year on the Quad, when President Biden pulled out of the 2023 Leaders Summit to be held in Australia due to the debt ceiling negotiations in Washington, and so much has happened since then. To start, I'd like to just acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I join you with today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. As we are all aware, the results of the American presidential election are in, and it shows that a new Trump administration presents unpredictability and potentially significant geopolitical shifts in terms of US engagement globally, and especially in the Indo-Pacific region. There's a lot of speculation in terms of strategic challenges and in terms of Trump's style that we're aware of from the first administration. And so to unpack all of this, I'm joined by thought leaders who will share how these shifts in US foreign policy could reshape one of the region's most consequential multilateral groupings, the Quad. So let me first begin by introducing the panel joining us today. First, Ms. Suhasini Haidar. Ms. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu at one of India's most widely read and respected newspapers, writing regularly on foreign policy issues. Prior to this, Suhasini was Foreign Affairs editor and primetime anchor for India's leading 24-hour English news channel CNN-IBN, where she presented the signature show Worldview with Suhasini Haidar, and correspondent for CNN's International's New Delhi bureau. She's the recipient of the prestigious Prem Bhatia Award for Excellence in Journalism, and Ms. Suhasini has also set a very high bar for thoughtful reporting and commentary. Welcome, Suhasini Haidar.
Thank you, Lisa.
Professor Ian Hall is a professor in international relations at Griffith University in Australia. He is renowned for his expertise on India's international relations and Indo-Pacific affairs, and he is sought after commentator on global issues. His impressive body of work includes 3 books, including the most recent book, Modi and the Reinvention of Indian Foreign Policy. And Professor Hall is also co-leading the Blue Security DFAT Regional Maritime Exchange Program at La Trobe University. Welcome, Professor Hall.
Thanks, Lisa. It's really good to be back.
And finally, Dr. Satoru Nagao, fellow at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Nagao's primary research area is US-Japan-India security cooperation. And Dr. Nagao is a regular commentator on international security issues, particularly matters pertaining to the Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Nagao was awarded his PhD by Hudson University in 2011 for his thesis, India's Military Strategy, the first such research thesis on this topic in Japan. He holds many research positions, including Senior Research Fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, Specially Appointed Research Fellow at the Japan Forum on International Relations, Research Fellow at the Institute for Future Engineering, Strategy Defence Policy, and a lecturer at Hudson University, amongst others. Welcome, Dr. Nagao.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists so much for joining us today. As we know, the Quad today in 2024 is quite different to when it was first incepted nearly 20 years ago as a response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. As a diplomatic multilateral partnership, the Quad's member countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, focus on supporting an open, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region through security initiatives, through humanitarian aid, building trade and investment, and through addressing climate change, amongst other things. And I think it's fair today that the Quad's mission has only become even more important in today's world, shaped by the ongoing geopolitical tensions in our region, as well as ongoing war and conflicts such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon conflicts. These events have added to new complex layers to addressing global governance in order to maintain peace and security. But the third in-person Quad Leaders Summit was held in Japan September of this year, where they issued a joint vision statement on the region and the future of the Quad. And that statement really focused on tackling the region's most pressing challenges: health security, climate change, infrastructure, critical and emerging technology, disaster relief, space, maritime security, and countering disinformation, amongst others. But what we've seen is really an evolution, I would say, of the Quad, resurrected against the backdrop of China's assertiveness in the region. And it has really grown into a platform to address broader issues, from traditional security to more human security issues. But now, of course, we find ourselves not just with Quad 2.0, but with Trump 2.0. And his assertiveness and often unpredictable stance on multilateral groupings raises important questions about the future of the Quad. And that really brings me to our first question today. Given all of this context, I want to ask our panelists, to how we're going to explore really how might the Quad adapt to these shifts in US foreign policy under President-elect Trump's leadership, particularly given he's got an America First worldview. I might start with you, Professor Hall.
Many thanks, Lisa, and it's really good to be having this conversation again a year on from last year, and how much has changed in the last 12 months. I think the challenge with Trump 2.0 generally is that in a way Trump is both a non-quantity, and at the same time we also know that the other side of this coin is that we know how unpredictable he can be, how disruptive he can be, how problematic he can be, and how he's going to treat everything, including things like the Quad, with a lot less reverence and care than perhaps some other presidents might do. Even though the resurrected Quad, the Quad that we now have, was the creation of the first Trump administration. It was resurrected at the end of 2017 as part of the Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy. It's born of that administration, and it belongs to that administration. Because Trump's not sentimental, so I don't imagine that Trump is going to treat the Quad any more sensitively than he might do with anything else. I think that the Trump administration is going to ask some big questions of the Quad, actually. I think it's going to ask some questions about not just how the Quad has evolved and what it now does, but what it's for and what it's going to do. I think it's going to perhaps push back on some of the areas in which the Quad has moved, particularly around climate, possibly around energy, perhaps also about supply chains and so on. I think the Trump administration, given the shape of the cabinet, particularly in those key national security positions, we now have 3 China hawks. I imagine that the Trump administration could well push the Quad to do much more in defense and security. And that's going to be a challenge for each one of the countries involved, including for Australia, as to how comfortable each one of those 3 is about advancing that particular agenda. My view is that I think Japan, under its current leadership, may be more keen to advance that agenda, given that we know that the current Prime Minister, while he was Defense Minister, was very interested in deepening defense and security cooperation in the region. But Australia might be a little bit uncomfortable about this for various reasons, and India may be too. So lots of questions, not a lot of answers, I think, in terms of the Quad and in terms of Trump 2.0.
Thank you, Ian. I really want to ask, what your responses are for the 3 countries to this newfound reality. But first, before we get to that, let's just stick to the Quad as a whole. Dr. Nagao, can I ask you how you see the Quad in terms of adapting to these shifts of a new Trump presidency?
Thank you very much for asking. Yes, originally, Quad in Indo-Pacific, this kind of the idea came from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, so that we believe that this is Japan origin concept, even if the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe did not use Indo-Pacific when he addressed in the Indian Parliament in 2007. So Prime Minister, President Trump accepted this idea as American strategy, I believe, so because of the idea itself is, of course, quite much with the U.S. interest, of course, but at the same time, the personal relation between the President Trump and the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was good. So that's why Japan can show the relatively big influence that region, that age. But currently, Japan faces a problem internally because Prime Minister Ishiba lacks his power in the domestic politics. He needs a coalition to maintain his power as a government. So that's why every time he needs to persuade the other party to decide something. Under the Trump age, there is a high possibility that Trump will demand relatively strong. Even if the Prime Minister was Shinzo Abe, the demand itself was very strong. So even if the Quad, the main interest against China is the same between Japan and the United States or other Quad members, but demand itself is relatively strong. For example, the increase in the defense budget. And when President Trump negotiates, every time that this negotiation is a very simple bilateral base by using the intimidation-related remark, Japan should pay 5 times more, something like that. 5 times, wow, something like that. So that has happened. After that, in the deal has happened only the 2 times increase, but not just double, but not 5 times. But when President Trump asked Japan, initially this was 5 times. So that will repeat again, we believe. So that's why can Prime Minister Ishiba government reply this? I don't think so. That is a problem because he lacks internal power. He needs to persuade a coalition partner or the opposition party to go through this kind of idea, but which he can agree with President Trump. But he lacks such kind of power in the domestic politics. So under such kind of situation, indeed Japan is worrying the situation now, which is indeed internal matter. And next year, there is an election in summer, and this is upper house election. And there is a high possibility that this election will decide what kind of agreement Japan can do with the United States. Before it, Japan cannot show the strong influence. But that is my analysis. So maybe I will explain a little more about the Trump administration later. Just now, this is my explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao. I mean, you've given us quite a bit of a perspective there from what this means in terms of the new Trump administration for Japan and particularly the Japanese government. Does any of our, before I move to Suhasini, does any of our panelists wish to respond to Dr. Nagao on that?
Well, I'd certainly be interested in how Prime Minister Ishiba really will see the Quad, simply because of what we've seen in the last couple of years when it comes to how the US itself and the Biden administration, and I know this is not a popular idea, but somehow it seemed in the last few years as the Quad was important, but it was not the preeminent or the most dominant sort of grouping for the US's Indo-Pacific policy anymore. And what we saw was essentially other meetings take priorities, to the point that we weren't able to hold the Quad summit in India as it was planned last year, simply because Mr. Biden had other things to do. But more to the point that the US started to explore other groupings. So AUKUS became important because it also has if you like, a strategic power punch with the submarines as a part of the deal. We also saw Kurt Campbell spend a lot of time in the region looking at Quad Plus partners, which involves countries like the Philippines, South Korea, and those kind of things. So I'm interested by, do you think under Prime Minister Ishiba, the Quad be the preeminent sort of grouping for dealing with the Indo-Pacific policy?
Dr. Nagao, did you wish to respond?
Yes, Ishiba's idea is based on Asian NATO. He published this article in the Hudson Institute one day before he sworn in. But at the same time, his idea is his idea, and Japan's policy is Japan's policy, I believe. Because firstly, his idea Asia's NATO is simply said, they try to make something cooperation framework to deal with China. But if so, indeed, this idea is not so different with traditional Japan's idea with other prime ministers, including Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe knows India or the Southeast Asian country very well. That's why he did not use something specific alliance as a word. But Ishiba used, that is different. But that is caused from just the knowledge about Southeast Asia and India. Indeed, the direction itself is the same. Japan tried to form international coalition against China because China's rapid military modernization is too fast-paced to catch up. And because indeed, because of the China's pattern of the territory expansion, military balance is very effective. I need to explain a little about it because what happened in South China Sea indicates this. In 1950s, when France withdrew, China occupied half of the Paracel Island. In 1970s, when US withdrew from Vietnam, China occupied another half of the Paracel Island. In 1980, when Soviet troops reduced the number in Vietnam, China occupied 6 feet of the Spratly Island. In 1990, when US withdrew from Philippines, China occupied Mississippi. Every time military balance has changed, they find the power vacuum, they steal it. That is the pattern of China's territory expansion. So to reply this, Japan needs a military balance. Maintaining military balance is an interest. But Japan alone, we cannot catch up because China is rich. That's a big problem. That's why Japan tried to seek the coalition partner. Alliance. So the Asian NATO, which is clearly the very fixed NATO type alliance, Ishiba said. But Prime Minister Abe is more practical. Do not use the word of the alliance, the Quad, the cooperation. But the direction is same. Direction is same. This is a traditional pattern of Japan way of thinking. And Japan try to cooperate with other countries as a military. So Quad, OCAS is not the matter. Anyway, we need reinforcement. And that is direction. And so the problem is currently, compared with the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, which has strong power in the international politics, Ishiba lacks their power in the international politics. So any idea, he insists, no one listens in the international stage. Because Ishiba want to make sure other countries do not agree and do not accept the idea because Ishiba do not have the power to make this idea the real one. So that's why that is a problem. And repeatedly, I said this is a problem. Well, thank you.
Thanks,
this is
Dr. Thank you. It's a very, very good distinction you've created between Ishiba and Abe in terms of what we now are dealing with in terms of the Quad and the Trump administration. I want to ask you then, Suhasini, in terms of India. Obviously, India's reaction is been quite measured, I think, here, perhaps in compared to the West in relation to the election of Donald Trump. And I wanted to ask you what you put that down to. Is it because Prime Minister Modi and President Trump worked well together in the past when Trump was in his last administration?
Yes, short answer to that question is there's a certain confidence level in India that the government, particularly Prime Minister Modi, dealt with President Trump and can deal with him in a new administration. And of course, there are a number of reasons why, in any case, India has felt that since 1998, so about 25 years that we're looking at, India-US ties have increased, have strengthened regardless of who's in power. So there's also an underlying confidence that that is likely to continue. But I do want to, the specifics of India and the Quad vis-a-vis the new Trump administration is, I know, a question we'll want to delve into a bit deeper. But I do want to make the point of what the Trump effect on the Quad is likely to be. We've already seen a number of very interesting articles come out on what that's likely to be. The first thing we have to accept is the fact that we're discussing this implies something we have always, the opposite of which we have always thought was a precept, that the US foreign policy, in a sense, has a continuum to it. But with Mr. Trump in power, there's no such understanding. So we do need to discuss which of the US policies of the past 4 years will actually continue, or will we see more of the previous 4 years continue? How is he going to tackle that? The first is, and I think Professor Hall already spoke about the unpredictable nature of Mr. Trump. So we actually don't know how he is going to tackle certain issues. For example, in the last administration, when he really tried to reach out to the North Korean leader, I think that had its own repercussions in the rest of the region, and including in the Quad countries, particularly in Japan. So that kind of unpredictable nature could have an impact in terms of the Quad itself. I think the second part is his transactional nature, which we've all acknowledged, and Professor Dr. Nagao also spoke about the need for each of them to give back. I don't think I'm giving away any secrets, but there's this famous story always spoken about on the day that the U.S. Pacific Command changed the name to the Indo-Pacific Command. The story goes that Mr. Trump got onto a plane, and he was explained this by his his military commanders, that the big briefing was on the fact that it was now going to be called U.S. Indo-PACOM, and his immediate response was, why? What are we getting from India for this? Now that's maybe folklore. It may not be true, but the truth is that there is an understanding that everything that Mr. Trump does will come with a kind of what is in it for the United States. What are you doing in return for what I do? And we in India have actually romanticized the idea that Mr. Trump brought the Quad back in 2017. It was at that time still just the kernel of an idea. I think it was taken forward much more, as Dr. Nagao said, by Shinzo Abe, by Prime Minister Modi, and taken forward by a series of Australian prime ministers. If you remember, to begin with, we're still a little unsure about taking part in, say, a Malabar, or how the Quad would move. But over the years, it did. And of course, the greatest contribution, in a sense, to the Quad has been China's. Because its actions have, in a sense, spurred all the countries in the Quad closer together. But the idea that Mr. Trump was responsible for the Quad as it is today, I don't think is true. I think that was a factor of bumping it up to a leadership level, a summit level exercise, and all the different ideas out of COVID that came with that. So that's the second, is the transactional nature. What is he going to want in return? I think the third, and Lisa, you put your finger on it when you said he's not known for his multilateral style. He's not known for dealing well in these multilateral exercises. In fact, at the rebirth, as we call it, of the Quad there in the Philippines in 2017, when officials met at, I think, a joint secretary level of the 4 Quad countries, Mr. Trump actually skipped the East Asian summit that he was supposed to attend. And he had stayed on an extra day for, and just decided he didn't want to be a part of it. So, India will watch that particularly closely, since India is going to host the Quad, in 2025. And then finally, what I just spoke about in my question to Dr. Nagao as well, I think we have to look at where the Quad will be vis-a-vis the Trump administration. In terms of what are some of the counters they're looking at. Is Quad producing, for example, a similar kind of result. I know Quad is a great feeling. We've heard it described, as all kinds of things, of friends sitting in a car, passing out the beers, of, the Beatles, of all kinds of references to the Quad, which essentially bring a smile to your face. They do great things together. But is it going to be the counter to essentially in the Indo-Pacific, for the security of the Indo-Pacific, in quite the same way as the US has already envisaged with AUKUS, with Australia and the UK, or has done with the Quad Plus countries, which are also seen as allies? Can they do the same with the Quad? Apart from that, apart from all these caveats I've given, I think in India there's a genuine optimism about a Trump term, partly because of the obvious personal connection between Prime Minister Modi and Mr. Trump, the obvious members of the cabinet who are well disposed towards India's policies, as well, whether it is in the latest FBI appointment of Kash Patel, but more importantly, the National Security Advisor, Waltz, is someone who has always had a very positive view of relations with India. We see it, with the Secretary of State designate, I should say, for all of them. We see it with the DNI designate as well. So in those terms, it would seem the stars are aligned for the Quad to do something bigger with all of the caveats I mentioned.
Well, Suhasini, you've given a really, really introspective view of the Quad in terms of from an India perspective, but also more broadly, and very different from what we heard from Dr. Nagao in terms of the different leadership styles of Prime Ministers Modi and Ishiba. So, Ian, Professor Hall, I should say, I wanted to then therefore ask you of the final country now in our Quad makeup to discuss, which of course is Australia, and what this does mean in terms of Australia. We've obviously had a very long-held alliance, formal alliance with the United States, but of course Labor was not in power the last time Trump was president. So how do you see the current Labor government, the Australian government reaction, and what it might mean perhaps for domestic politics here in Australia with the fact that we have an upcoming election?
It's going to be hugely challenging, isn't it? I think in a way, Australia has a little bit more breathing space than the other two, however, in several different reasons for that, I think. First thing is, that we're unlikely to face the same kind of pressure around the alliance, perhaps around AUKUS later on, as Japan is. So we may face some AUKUS pressure that could be positive in terms of the Quad, in the sense that it will take attention away from the Quad and it'll focus it much more on AUKUS, even if that will cause us issues over there. I think the second issue is we're not hosting the Quad summit next year. So it's going to be, it'll be the ball is very much in India's court to set the agenda, to establish a new narrative, and to draw Trump into the Quad. And we can support India in doing that, but it's, I think happily we're able to pass the buck on this one, if we're going to be frank about it. And then the other issue is, we have an election coming up too, and that means that inevitably all countries pull back a little bit from foreign policy, and Australia will be no different. And there's a little bit of leeway, even from a Trump administration, I think, in terms of allowing us to do that. All of that said, I think the next Quad agenda could be really challenging for Australia. Australia has been quite tentative around the Quad, especially under the current government, but actually on the previous one as well. It's been very concerned about Pacific Island and Southeast Asian sensitivities, particularly around us doing more together on defense and security. My intuition is that that's where the pressure is going to come, that we're going to be asked to do more quadrilaterally on defense and security with our partners. And we're going to then have to perhaps moderate some of the reluctance that we've had when it comes to Southeast Asia and when it comes to the Pacific, And that's going to be hard because we could see the Quad walking away from some areas like climate, clean energy, those kinds of things, which would be intrinsically appealing to countries in the Pacific or Southeast Asia and so on, and make the Quad look better for those partners. So in other words, we often say we don't want countries in the region to have to make a choice, but I feel like choices are looming for Australia, and that's going to be challenging for us.
Well, in terms of some of those choices, I mean, I think, Professor Hall, if we break it down, particularly as Suhasini's mentioned, the transactional nature of President Trump, if we compare that to the Quad being a grouping which does seem to have a set of sort of principles around the delivery of public goods, be that in vaccines or in a myriad of working groups that's broadened its agenda around that sort of framework of the delivery of public goods. One of them that really does unite Quad members is the issue of tackling climate change. Now, obviously during his campaigns, President Trump dismissed climate change as a hoax. It's clearly a position that contrasts sharply with the Quad's emphasis on addressing this global challenge. And, it has a dedicated working group on it. So considering the Quad doesn't have a structured framework per se, it's a loose grouping. Quad nations are free to unlink themselves from specific Quad initiatives. How might Trump's stance on climate change impact the Quad's efforts on this particular issue in terms of how it goes forward with that initiative? Dr. Nagao, do you have a view on that?
Yes. Well, in Japan, U.S.-China competition is indeed one shall stand, one shall fall competition. So Obama, Trump, Biden, there is a consistency, and the view from the last 250 years, the United States hasn't allowed any rival to survive. So this means that U.S.-China competition will escalate, and this is the competition to decide who will be the leader of the world. So that's why under the Trump administration or under the Biden administration, indeed strategic direction is same and no difference. But at the same time, the Trump administration more focusing on the military issue against China, we believe, and increasing defense budget is demand. And compare with Biden administration, not focusing on the climate change or other factor, other aspect of the Quad. And at the same time, both good and bad exist, but under the Trump administration, not like the Biden administration, it could be the simple diplomatic bilateral trade. For example, under the Biden administration, democracy or not is a matter in the many cases. Ideology is a matter. For example, Indonesia's elections, Indonesia, this is not fair. Modi wins elections, this is not fair, or fair, not fair. Such kind of discussion was exist under the Biden administration. But under the Trump administration, he do not care about this, I believe. Because during the first time of the Trump administration, the first foreign country he visited is Saudi Arabia. In the Southeast Asia, he visited Vietnam, but not join the East Asian Summit. Vietnam or Saudi Arabia, both are not democratic country. That is not matter. Counter China, we need this. This is the partner. Some more simple. So that's why the view from Asia, indeed, when we talk about Quad, indeed, this negotiation could be the more simple one, I believe. But at the same time, some cases, Biden administration seeks a multinational cooperation like IPEF, try to create counter market against Chinese market and not depend on Chinese market so much. That is, of course, one of the good way to deal with China's influence. But at the same time, Trump do not interest in this kind of multinational or complicated negotiation related with economic security. More military, I believe. So that's why simple, but at the same time, the other issue, maybe he do not interest in. That is my answer. Negotiation is simple, intimidation after that deal. Something like that bilateral basis, even in the Quad country, increasing the defense budget, maintain military balance. You are free rider, you must pay more. Something like that, I believe.
Okay, so climate policy could definitely be on the, well, maybe not on the chopping block, but at least definitely challenged under Quad 2.0 plus Trump 2.0. I do want to ask you as panelists about his position on tariffs. Before I do that, I do need to tell our audience that you will have the opportunity to have one of your questions answered. There will be a limited amount of time before we end this webinar, so please put them in the chat and we will hopefully get to at least a couple of them. But on tariffs, can I just say his proposed tariffs announcement that he will impose additional tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China has really sort of shifted the balance in a sense towards more of a trade war, and appears to be very much in conflict with the Quad's emphasis on free and fair trade across the Indo-Pacific. So, Ian, I wanted to ask you, might these tariff policies disrupt regional trade and supply chain dynamics? What sort of measures can the Quad take really as a grouping if you have one of its members with this sort of approach? Can it have any safeguarding to its vision of economic openness?
Well, yes, and the tariffs are a challenge to global economic stability and cooperation in this really important space, just generally. I think the other challenge, very specific challenge to this part of the world, is also that Trump has not committed to the Indo-Pacific economic framework, in which Japan is very invested, and which was promising to make some big inroads in terms of shifting supply chains, investment patterns, and so on across the region. If that initiative is diminished by Trump, as well as along with the tariff impositions, then a lot of the work that the Quad countries have done in the last few years will threatens to unravel, and I think that's where it'll depend here on not just on Trump's national security team, but also engaging his economic team, which is not yet in place. Each one of the Quad countries is going to have to individually and collectively try to explain some of the negative impacts that some of these policies will have, not just on China, but also on some of the other actors in the region.
All right. Look, I think we should move now. Thank you, Professor Hall, to our audience. We have some really good questions that have come in, and I might start with you, Suhasini, because one of them relates to the India-China border de-escalation deal. The question goes to this, and that is that China appears to be offering concessions to India over the border disengagement. And therefore, if India remains away from the Quad, China may further offer to resolve the border issue. The border issue. So, is it that India will play less of an active role in the Quad because of this, or will it stay in as it currently is?
Well, even if, and I'm not sure the characterization that China is offering concessions to India is correct. Simply because we don't know enough about this deal at the line of actual control. All we do know is that the two sides have agreed to disengage. And as a result of that agreement, they have very quickly spoken about working towards normalization of ties. So in other words, everything, in a sense, pre-2020, while Mr. Trump was last in power, is expected to just go back to the way it was. Whether or not it does on the ground in the LAC, but certainly things like going back to trade, investment, direct flights, visas between the two countries, and that sort of thing. If that is the case, then I think the same underpinnings exist for India as it did when India agreed to the upgradation of the Quad, when India agreed to being a part of it. It's still staying away from the idea of an alliance. If anything, the last few years post Russia's invasion of Ukraine have got the Indian leadership reaffirming their desire for strategic autonomy, not to be part of alliances. And if you like, in fact, explaining that to the world as its confirmed policy. So if, in other words, in the previous Trump era, there was a sense that India was moving into a kind of clinch with the US, which would look like an alliance. The war in Russia and Ukraine has shown us that there are two ways about that. So I wouldn't be too sure if the situation for India will change that much as a result of this LAC agreement. What I certainly think it shows is that Mr. Trump's return to power, and remember, this was something that was expected in India, I think ever since July this year, regardless of the changes in the Democrat candidature, the understanding in Delhi was quite clear that they thought Mr. Trump was winning this. So they have been preparing for it. They do want to get ahead of it this time and not be taken by surprise as much of the world was in 2016. So there has been a kind of understanding that if he does come to power, they do need to ensure that no other relations are affected in a sense because of that unpredictable nature. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is we may have even seen the India-China agreement being hastened because it seemed like there's going to be turbulence ahead. Let's not allow another factor, i.e. the US's unpredictability, to somehow have an impact there. So I'm just saying that the timing, in fact, may have been spurred by this. Otherwise, the India-China equation is as it was in 2020. You remember Mr. Trump went on Twitter and said that he had spoken to Mr. Modi and that, quote unquote, Mr. Modi was not in a good mood about what had happened with China, but that he was insistent that India would sort this out bilaterally. I don't think anything has changed if you look at the broader contours of it all.
Well, definitely President Xi Jinping made the most of the timing in terms of the recent G20 and APEC meetings, and I think even some bilateral...
And BRICS. And that brings us to the other question of Mr. Trump's latest tweet about BRICS.
Yes.
Sort of virtually accusing them of starting a new currency, but actually that's not something that was on the BRICS agenda last. But it gives you a sense, we're still 2 months and more away from Mr. Trump actually taking over as president. And we're already, the training wheels are off. We know what we're going to expect in a couple of months. And I hope, that the world is actually better prepared for it.
Yeah. I'd have to agree with that. And I have to say, from the West, I don't think the BRICS has ever had so much tension as what's just happened in the last sort of 48 hours. But I have another question, Professor Hall. I'm going to ask you in terms from our audience. The question is, if the US doesn't continue with a de facto leadership role in the Quad, which country out of the other three can be expected to step up into that role to keep the Quad as a strong grouping that it is?
Well, that's an excellent question. And in fact, I was just this afternoon trying to write something about that. There's no obvious candidate actually to take over the leadership of the Quad as things presently stand. I think, India is kind of institutionally well positioned in the sense that it's going to be running the summit next year. And of course, too, Narendra Modi is the senior leader, if you like, the one that's been in power the longest and has the most experience with the grouping. And in addition to that, he's got Dr. Jaishankar next to him as External Affairs Minister. And as Dr. Jaishankar says in every speech he gives around about the Quad, he was there right at the beginning of the Quad in the initial initiatives back after the Indian Ocean, after the tsunami and so on. So there's a lot of institutional memory there in India. And I'm still not convinced, though, that India is necessarily going to take over the leadership. I don't think Australia is well positioned for all the domestic political reasons that we've got. I think in a way, the dark horse here is Prime Minister Ishiba in Japan. Notwithstanding all the issues that Dr. Nagao has talked about in terms of his domestic political weaknesses, I think the fact that he's been willing to air some ideas about defense and security cooperation in the region that previously have not been talked about very much and not been talked about by people of his seniority, suggests to me that there's an opportunity there for Japan, and even though it may be difficult, but yes, there's no obvious answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Nagao, I'm going to ask you a question from the audience we have that's about the fact that there was an attempt to interlink the Indo-Pacific security architecture with the European security architecture by the Biden administration. How do you see that evolving after January next year?
Yes, my strategic situation is same, and the U.S. policy toward China is the same. And if I believe, indeed, long-term change is something consistency, which is U.S. asked Japan to cooperate with other U.S. allies, and that is anyway we need to do that. So Japan cooperate with other U.S. allies like Australia and European allies, British, France, Germany. Recently, even Netherlands, Czech, Estonia cooperate with Japan. So that's why this move, Japan will continue to promote relation with them. But at the same time, if Japanese leader, Japanese bureaucrats understand how important Asia, how important regional countries, of course, Japan will focus on regional countries like India, especially the last prime ministers, not only the Shinzo Abe, but also the Suga or Kishida visit Vietnam, Indonesia, especially with India. So that's why this country are main partner and of Japan. So Japan focusing on. And indeed, not like the United States. U.S. When the president changed, two-thirds of the bureaucrats also changed. But in Japan, bureaucrats are same. So indeed, because of this, bureaucrats continue the same policy in the long term. In this case, even if the prime minister do not have the power, Japan will continue the policy which created under the Abe's administration. Abe is an exceptional person. He can create a new strategy in many places, that's true. But after that, we cannot find any such kind of creator. So this means that bureaucrats will continue the policy already made. So Japan will continue to cooperate with many US allies and the Asian partner at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao. Suhasini, I wanted to come back to you. We touched on earlier, I think both of us, about the fact that, Trump has an America first approach. He leans away from multilateralism. We're talking today about this important grouping of the Quad, or Quad 2.0 as it is now. Do you think these Quad nations would still be inclined to want to broaden their reach by engaging with either other regional groupings or expanding the membership, of a potential Quad Plus, which has been talked about from time to time, considering this America First approach by President Trump?
Well, Lisa, I think what makes the Quad work is essentially that the United States is a part of it. So I don't think a Quad minus US remains the Quad, and then you can just replace the US with any of the other Quad Plus members. Secondly, we have not yet seen a formal proposal that has been accepted by the Quad members when it comes to Quad expansion of any kind. I presume that is because the Quad Quad is still pretty young in terms of what they can justifiably do together. There's a lot of things, as you said, there's a plethora of different subcommittees, but it runs the risk of being a kind of death by committee kind of operation unless they're able to show that the Quad is working together. I think on a previous AII seminar, we talk threadbare each of the Quad initiatives, whether it was the vaccines, whether it's critical, and emerging technologies, whether it is IPEF, and where they're still pretty short on seeing real communication. India, for example, is still not part of the IPEF's trade portal. Now I think it'll be even more difficult, because who knows if Mr. Trump himself is going to want to be a part of that. We know that from past experience that while he likes FTAs with countries, and he certainly tried to negotiate one with India, he was not really necessarily in favor of the larger FTAs we've seen. We also see, I don't know if you're following, and certainly your scholars should be seeing the increased commentary in Indian newspapers about the possibility of India rejoining RCEP. And that's very interesting to me, because these are the same voices that just a few years ago were really ridiculing India's any chance of India coming back to RCEP. And why that's happening is, again, a kind of response to what Mr. Trump might do vis-a-vis tariffs, vis-a-vis what you're referring to, protection. So there is a fear already about what he'll do with tariffs. I think amidst all the very positive conversations about what Mr. Trump and India can do together, I think there's also the underlying worry. Look, he is unpredictable. He did, completely withdraw India's GSP status. This is a special status for exporters in developing countries. And Mr. Trump withdrew that overnight, not because India is no longer a developing country, but because he felt India was not playing ball on the tariffs issue, on the free trade issue, on the other things he had demanded, for example, zeroing out all tariffs on Harley-Davidson. So there's that. Part of the transactionalism is also a willingness to push the envelope when it comes to, how to put it politely, but bullying another country. Everyone is aware in the last few years of how India has stood its ground with the Biden administration, with other members, with Japan as well, requesting India to cut its dependence on Russia when it comes to oil, or to not increase. India, in fact, went from getting 2% of its oil, or less than 1% to begin with, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to now taking about 40% of its oil from Russia. Now, while Mr. Trump might not actually in any way ruffle that arrangement, his methods, if you remember, were very different from the Biden administration's methods. So the Biden administration opened talks with India for months about reducing its oil intake, reducing its dealings with Russia. It then went into kind of explaining it away and saying it actually helps the oil market worldwide if India continues to get its oil from Russia. They found other ways around it. However, Mr. Trump did not do that. In 2016, when he decided that he was going to revoke the JCPOA, when he was going to walk out of dealing with Iran, he gave a firm sort of deadline to countries and said, within 6 months, zero out all your oil imports from Iran. At the time, India was taking about 12% of its oil from Iran. It was sweeter crude. It was cheaper. It came from much closer to India than, for example, Russia does. And yet, within 6 months, the Modi government agreed to zero out its oil imports from Iran. So straight away there, you have what a US administration is willing to do under Mr. Trump, what it's willing to do under Mr. Biden, or any of the others that preceded Mr. Trump, and how India has responded to that. So there's the second big worry is really about how far he's willing to go. The third, I will say, is the Musk factor. Mr. Musk has obviously become a big part of Mr. Trump's forays in terms of government efficiency and stuff. But we're also going to have to see how Mr. Musk's worldview and his investments in the region, particularly in China, when it comes to EV technology and critical minerals and that sort of thing, how that translates into the US's relationships with each of our countries. For example, Mr. Musk has been talking to India, but not actually been able to set up in India because of the differences over tariffs, because of the difference over import waivers that he wants for the moment, or tax holidays, and all of the rest of that. And fourthly, there will be the constant push that countries in this region must find ways to, in a sense, invest in the US. What you pointed out, that it's not just America first. You have to very publicly show that you are now going to be putting money into the US. In fact, we should have had someone perhaps from the US on to explain how they are going to see the Quad working out. But I can tell you, we've already seen businessmen like Mr. Adani tweet, "I'm going to put $10 billion into the Trumpian America, if you like." We've seen others talking much more that kind of language, because that's what you'll be asked for. And during Mr. Trump's last term, he insisted on an Indian investment by a public sector organization into a LNG plant in Louisiana for $2.5 billion. That MOU actually went away. The MOU was signed, but it went away after Mr. Trump lost power. The question is it going to come back, or will other deals like it come back? So I think the question you had about American protectionism is going to worry the Quad in parts as well as a whole. It's not just about what it will mean for the Quad itself, but for each of the countries.
Well, thank you, Suhasini. And look, I think thinking about that and the Quad as a whole, I want to end with one last question to Professor Hall. To build on what Suhasini has just outlined about, we've talked a lot today about the unpredictability of Trump, his transactional nature, his sort of ham-fisted approach as president. We're looking at this, in terms of the Quad, which is, it's a loose grouping, it's not a formal alliance, there is no secretariat, there's no headquarters like NATO or the UN. And whilst this might make the Quad more flexible, it also makes it more tenuous than other partnerships that do exist in that multilateral or unilateral space. So does that make the future of the Quad risky under a Trump administration? Do we see sort of Quad 2.0 continuing to be, the very expanded, strong, active, and at a leadership level grouping that it has been for the past little while?
Look, I think I'm a little bit more confident about the future of the Quad than I might be about some of the other bodies that are around. A little bit more confident because of that flexibility. I think that the Quad's virtue is that it doesn't have a fixed agenda. It can change over time. And so the big challenge is going to be for the three countries and the US to establish a new set of priorities under a new president, under a new administration, and then to take this forward. And the other big challenge, and perhaps the bigger challenge, is going to be demonstrating the value of the Quad. So one thing that we have said all along, since 2017 onwards, we've kept saying, we're not articulating the value of the Quad. We're not articulating what the Quad does. We need a one-line explanation of why the Quad matters, of what it's all about and what it does. That's even more important when you're dealing with someone like Trump. He's a marketing man fundamentally. He cares about the slogan. He cares about that one-liner. And we need to collectively get that one-liner right, and so that when he asks the question about what the Quad is and what the Quad is doing for the United States and what the Quad is achieving, we need to be able to answer that very, very clearly. And I've no doubt that all the governments concerned are thinking about that, but we do need to have that line very worked out and very articulate.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. It has been brilliant to hear your insights on this assessing the Quad under a Trump presidency to come. So thank you, Dr. Nagao from Japan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ian Hall from Queensland.
Thank you so much. It's been great having this conversation.
And thank you, Suhasini Haidar from New Delhi.
Thank you, and namaste to all.
And thank you to the audience for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Australia India Institute's website as a video recording, and we'll also make it available on the Institute's Chats Over Chai podcast channel. I'm Lisa Singh, signing off from Sydney. See you next time.